Hello, my name is Curtis, last name DoesADig, and I'm here to talk to you about the minigames I had been developing for the GOAT SMP Season 2. To start off, I would like to preface all of this with the fact that I have a bachelor's degree in computer science with a focus on game programming. I specialize in using the Unity game engine, which is what I use to develop these minigames. I had been developing using the Unity game engine for 5 years now and have a strong grasp on game development. I also have been doing Minecraft YouTube for the last year and a half, as many of you know, and wanted this current season on the GOAT SMP to be unique to all other Minecraft Let's Plays. So I decided to put my two passions together and create minigames to display in my videos. The original plan was that I would just visually showcase a new minigame in each episode. However, between episode 3 and 4, I decided that I would compile them all into one project for my subscribers to play. Now, this posed a few problems. The first being, I developed each game prior to this decision as its own standalone project, meaning if I wanted to compile them all together, I would have to set up a system that would allow players to choose a minigame and make sure that it works correctly in the new environment. That one is easy enough, just make sure it works. Great, got it. The second being, I developed each game prior to this decision with the idea that only I would ever play it, so if any bugs came up, I could just restart the recording and do it again until I get it right without any issues. And between you and I, there were a lot of bugs in the beginning. This is because I was writing code that would cut corners in the design of the game, and because no one would ever have to play them themselves, they would have no idea that I did this. However, with the decision to compile them for everybody to play, I had to uncut these corners and do it right. And lastly, most of the features of each minigame had the same code that was just slightly different, which means I had to account for that for every single minigame to make sure they worked as intended for each. To start us off, let's go back in time to Season 1 on the GOAT SMP. Towards the end of the season, I had modeled in the 3D modeling software Blender a Minecraft character model. I rigged it with an armature and threw my skin onto it, and voila, Minecraft characters. At the time of making this, I only planned on using it for video thumbnails, which I have done frequently in my episodes. The end of Season 1 saw all of our members falling into the void, so for the first minigame I decided that at the start of the first episode, I would have my character fall from Season 1's void into the overworld of Season 2. So I took some time brainstorming some ideas for how I could set it up and got to work. I initially imported the character model and skin into the project and set up a simple falling animation for it. All I did was pose it and slightly move its limbs over time. I also added line renderers on the hands to give it that feeling of downward motion. Next, I set up the character controller to allow the player to move around the screen, but not be able to move off of it. I also added some linear interpolation on the rotation to make the character rotate depending on the direction they were moving. With the animation, line renders, and being able to move around the screen, it was really close to looking like the player was falling. Emphasis on it was just looking like that. The player doesn't actually fall. They're actually only able to move forward, backward, left, and right, and everything else just makes it seem like they're falling. Now that the player could move, I decided they would need some sort of obstacle to prevent them from reaching the end. I couldn't think of any entity that I would want flying in the air or falling with them, so I just decided to have bedrock and obsidian flying at them. I also made it so if the player touches one of these blocks, they would be pushed away from it. The models for these were very easy, just some cubes with textures, boom, done. These actually finalized the feeling of falling for the player, and ironically, instead of anything actually falling towards the ground, everything else just kind of flies up towards the player. I then developed a simple health system that uses the Minecraft hearts and made it so touching those blocks would also reduce the number of hearts he had. When I originally developed this game, I didn't actually add a death menu because that wouldn't have been seen by the player. However, later on when the decision was made that players actually would be seeing it, I had to quickly scramble to add one in. I added in some Minecraft clouds to give it the feeling that the player was high up in the air and had them slightly move across the screen as the player falls past them. I used these clouds again much later, but for now this was their only use. The game also didn't have any real objective other than the fall, so I added in the ability to grab diamonds flying towards you. I modeled these diamonds by hand using a Blender technique that I will link below. But that wasn't enough and the game still got boring after a while. So finally, for the base gameplay of this minigame, I added in an ending, where a screenshot of the Season 2 overworld would come into view and the game would end, signifying that the player officially fell into Season 2. Some extra stuff I did was add sound effects, music, advancements, and a start button. Even though that was all unnecessary at the time, it became very important for the compilation later on. So with that first minigame out of the way, I felt very proud of myself. I spent a few days working everything out and getting it all set up, and that was on top of working 2 jobs and making the video itself. So I was really proud of how productive I was. And then the next week came. The following week, I already had my ideas ready and began working on the second minigame immediately. I was going to make a turn-based strategy of the player versus the Wither. Unlike me versus the Wither the first time, this one turned out to be very easy, and the hardest part was probably just modeling and texturing the Wither. You see, the player character is very easy to model and texture. It's 6 rectangular prisms put together. However, the Wither is a whole nether story. Anyway, the Wither has a lot of parts to it. And while I am extremely familiar with the Minecraft character model, the Wither is something I have never paid much attention to. I know it has 3 heads, broad shoulders, and a slender body, but other than that I wasn't so sure about how it looked. Not only that, I didn't have the Wither texture to work out the exact size of all its parts. What I ended up doing was going into my datapack world where I work on all of my datapacks and spawning in a Wither with no AI. So it wouldn't go flying around and shooting everything in its path. I then had to carefully study how each part looked up close and model it accordingly. I wanted to make sure I got it pixel perfect. This method would be very useful later on as well for future minigames. I was able to get the Wither modeled and ready for texturing. At that time, I didn't have a Wither texture to work with, nor did I know how to get one, so I made one myself and hoped for the best. And honestly, I think it did a pretty decent job. Afterwards, I set up a similar life system to that of the skydiving minigame, but also set up an energy system for the abilities. Basically, each ability has its own amount of energy required to use, and some actually increase your energy, so you kind of have to pick carefully. After setting up the system, I began working out what abilities I wanted the player and Wither to have. I decided for the Wither it would have its normal black skull and blue skull attacks, and they would do a different amount of damage each. I also wanted a non-attack ability, and I didn't know this at first, but apparently the Wither is actually able to heal over time, so I decided to add a healing ability to it. For the player, I wanted to do 4 different abilities, but I had to be careful to balance what they did. I added Punch, Sword, Eat, and Heal. Punch was an easy one. It does a small amount of damage, but replenishes a small amount of energy. Sword was also easy. It would do a larger amount of damage, but also require a large amount of energy. Eat would just replenish energy, and Heal would replenish health in exchange for energy. Once this was decided, I made a couple item models similar to how I modeled the diamonds for the first minigame. For the sword ability, I made a diamond sword. For the Eat ability, I made a golden carrot. And for the Heal ability, I made a potion of healing. I then began work on animating all of the abilities for both the player and Wither. The Wither was easy, because I just had to move them around and create a projectile for the skulls. The player was a little bit harder, but definitely no problem at all. Once that was done, I did the same thing I did for the first minigame and added sound effects and music. At this point, I didn't add any advancements because I really was running out of time. The first week was very productive. However, the second week I ran into so many minor issues that I almost didn't finish in time. All in all, I would say this was my favorite minigame to create. The next week came, and with it, the next minigame and episode. This minigame would be in reference to Pac-Man. But instead, I would have to replace the ghost with something a bit more sinister and deadly. Guardians. I figured since Pac-Man goes through a maze, this would be the perfect opportunity to include the ocean monument. After all, what is an ocean monument if not an underwater maze? From the last 2 minigames, I had a bit of practice getting minigames together rather quickly. I quickly modeled the Guardians and set up a maze similar to the Pac-Man maze, but it was made out of prismarine and dark prismarine blocks. I then wrote a grid system that would allow the player and Guardian to move through each tile. I decided on using prismarine crystals for the pack dots. Instead of placing them manually through the level, I made the grid system populate the empty tiles with them. These are modeled the same way as the other items in the minigames prior. I would say the hardest part about this one was the AI for the Guardians. I wrote 4 different programs to get the AI how I wanted it to work, similar to Pac-Man AI having 4 different programs determining the Ghost AI. One Guardian would constantly chase the player down and try to find the quickest path to get to them. This one was called Aggressive. The second one would attempt to get to a point the player is navigating to, called Ambush. The third would navigate to each of the 4 corners unless it spotted the player, called Patrol. And the last one would choose random points to try navigating to, called Random. I had spare time during the remainder of the week, and it was at this point that I made the near-fatal decision of compiling all the minigames into one project. I spent the remainder of the week working on systems that I could use for all of them. I first set up a life system that allows for different amounts of hearts that would be used for almost all the minigames. This system just required a number for how many hearts the minigame needed and access to a death overlay to display when the player runs out of health. The death overlay was different per minigame. Minecraft has a really fun feature that displays how the player died, and I wanted to do something similar. So when I compiled all the minigames, I made sure to include a unique death message for each. Afterwards, I set up the stat system that allows different stats to be kept track of and different events to happen when a specific stat reaches a certain amount. The main function of the system is to change a text field to reflect changes to a stat. For example, in the skydiving into Season 1 minigame, it would change the number in the item slot to reflect how many diamonds you have collected. The secondary feature triggers an event when a stat reaches a certain amount. For example, in the Monumental Success minigame, it would change the score depending on how many prismarine crystals you have collected, and once it reaches a certain amount, the system would trigger the win event. This also required me to create a win overlay to display when the player succeeds at a minigame. I figured since the death overlay displays a death message, it would be neat if the win overlay had a message that would be displayed for when the player wins. I also wrote code for a tool that would make making items in the minigames much easier. All it takes is the texture of an item from Minecraft and it can generate a 3D item for me to use. This would save me a significant amount of time. Each item took me about 15 or so minutes to get correct, which isn't a lot, but every minute counts when you only have 1 week to make a game. So the faster I could make items, the faster the minigames would be done, especially with this next minigame. Week 4 came and I began working on the new minigame under the assumption that all the minigames would be compiled together. I was also able to start reusing the life and stat systems and the death and win overlays to speed up my process. This minigame was very simple in design and execution, and it was really fun to set up. I used the item generator on the cobweb texture to generate the 3D cobweb item. I also drew a pole with a loop at the end and did the same thing. I then put these together and formed a net. Being able to make this net was my favorite part about this minigame. I then set up the level. I made some trees in the background with some beehives on the ground and some flowers that I used the item generators to create. All this would have taken me a few hours to make if I didn't design tools and reusable code to make it. I then put a bee in my datapack world to study it and figure out its dimensions, shape, and texture. I then modeled, textured, imported, and animated the bee, and we were all set. For the bees, I kind of wanted them to work a bit differently than Minecraft bees. Most of the bees would be passive and would go directly from their spawn point to a flower, then back to the beehive. This is their normal behavior in Minecraft, so that wasn't too much different. For the obstacle in the minigame, I added aggressive bees. Minecraft already has aggressive bees, however, if one bee is mad, all the other bees become mad too. So this was the small difference. These aggressive bees targeted the player immediately after spawning and went right for them. If the player was touched by them, then the player would be stung and lose a heart. The player would luckily be equipped with a net, courtesy of an amazing and talented game designer. Me. The player would be able to swing the net to collect bees. They'd be able to collect both passive and aggressive bees, and when the stat system reached 20, the game would be over and the player would have won. I then set up a bee spawn system which just had them randomly spawning on the circumference of a circle. The bees also don't collide with anything except the player, so they wouldn't get stuck on hives or trees. And that minigame was as good as done. As usual, the last thing I set up were some sound effects and music, and voila, finished! In between, episode 4 and 5 I had plenty of time to spare and began setting up new tools and systems to implement. I still had to compile everything prior to the bee minigame into the game, but before that, I wanted to make sure all the systems were in place. I designed a pretty robust audio manager system that would control all music and sound effects in the game. I then set up the main menu and character selection menu, which was really easy. Just rotate through the character list and replace the skin depending on which one was chosen. Or so I thought. What I didn't take into account is that Minecraft actually has 2 different character models, Classic and Slim. I spent the remaining free time modeling out the Slim character model and getting it prepped for the minigames. When the 5th week came, I already knew exactly what I wanted to do. I started the minigame inside of the compilation project so I wouldn't have to import it later. I set up a fence post and a grass floor. I put in the player character and made a brown line renderer from the fence post to the player. I then set up the camera and floor to move with the player as they fly. I made a system that allowed the player to drag the character back and release them to send them flying through the air like an Angry Bird. And set up the stat system to keep track of how far the player had been flung. It felt weird having the character in a singular rotation as they flew through the air, so I made it so the character rotates depending on their velocity. This actually created a very nice visual of their speed and direction, and really helped visually showcase what was happening in the game. I used the item generator to make a rocket and then added the slime block texture to a cube and used those for power-ups, which I randomly generate every 10 meters as the player traverses through the air. The rocket originally sped up the player as well as gave them height, but that ended up being extremely overpowered, and I had to reduce it, just making the player move a specific speed and direction. I then reused the cloud generator from the skydiving minigame for this and added clouds to the sky. This was a super simple minigame, but after much feedback about the project after I published it, I found that this was by far the favorite amongst players. Then, I slammed my head against the wall a few times, took a swig of my gamer fuel, and got to work on compiling the rest of the minigames. It actually wasn't as hard as I thought it was going to be. I just had to replace a lot of code with systems that I made later, which would improve performance and make it easier to change later if need be. The biggest problem I had was actually getting the font to work. You see, every time I imported the assets from one project into the compilation, the font would get messed up, either on the assets I was importing or on the compilation project itself. If it was the compilation project, I would have to go through each minigame again and reset the font. If it was the assets I was importing, I would have to do the same, but only on the assets that were messed up. It was not a hard thing to do, but it certainly was tedious, especially on minigames with a lot of text. The very last thing I added was the advancements to each minigame and an advancements list in the main menu. This was a lot of fun, and I wrote a whole system for giving advancements with their own unique text and icons. It was great! In this project I learned a lot of new things, one of which was making skyboxes. A skybox is a cube that is textured on each side to give a seamless transition. Most games use a skybox for stuff that is supposed to be really far away. I decided to learn how to make one for the main menu. I took screenshots in the Goat SMP community area facing in all 6 directions, and then used those screenshots to create a skybox for the main menu. I also learned a lot more about tools development and different things I can do for that, specifically with the mesh generation. I also learned that I should stick with the initial plan and not come up with new ideas later. And the final thing I learned was how to develop for Webgl, which in my case allowed this compilation to be played on a standard internet browser. Speaking of that, I compiled them all together and published them to itch.io. The link will be in the description below. I created a page for it that allows you to play the game in your browser, if your browser supports it, or you can download it and play it on the Windows computer. I would have attempted to make a Mac build, however, to do that I need a Mac, and that's not something I own, so I just, well, couldn't. But anyway, it was a lot of fun to make and I learned a lot of important skills and lessons. I think I could for sure do this again sometime, however, not once every week. It was very stressful doing everything within only a week's worth of time for each, and I might do at most in the future 1 every 2 weeks or even 3, but for sure I wouldn't mind trying to do something similar again. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the breakdown of the process and also enjoyed that I had many breakdowns making these. Remember, if you're not already subscribed, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to get notified when I upload a video. And if you're not following already, please consider following me on Twitter, Instagram, and supporting me on Patreon, all at CurtisDoesADig. I plan on making a new video this upcoming week about updates to a few data packs I've been working on, and I'd like you guys to check them out when it releases. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Have a good one!